Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 19th of December 2024. This is a 5-day update. I haven't done a Frontline update for 5 days. It is just a bit like that, but it's because I'm doing lives every day with Jonathan Fink and just time and whatnot. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Just before we go to the front line, and we can see there are lots of pins, as you would expect after 5 days. Let's go into the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, and see a couple of pointers on their report from last night. So this was a last night's report, which is already somewhat out of date and would have referred to the previous 24 48 hours. So with that in mind, there's some interesting little pieces on here. I'm taking this from the ATP Geopolitics ATP distilled website, where AI is distilling this into even more concise chunks. So a few pointers that are of interest. A Ukrainian battalion commander warned that Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups were themselves are disguising themselves in Ukrainian uniforms to penetrate Ukrainian units, which amounts to perfidy and constitutes a violation of the laws of war. So that is supposedly happening. A Ukrainian battalion commander reported on the 17th of December that Russian forces have used nearly 100 armoured and lightly armoured vehicles near Krylyakivka, which is southeast of Kupyansk, over the past 2.5 weeks, since roughly December the 1st, and that Ukrainian forces had destroyed 90 of those. 90%, that's 90 out of 100 vehicles. And that is in this area here, where you can see that actually the Ukrainians just north of there have had some success. The Russians pushing to the south of there and on that village area as well. Okay. Commander of the Ukrainian battalion operating in the Svatove direction reported that Russian forces took advantage of poor weather conditions to conduct an assault involving about 60 personnel, buggies, armoured personnel carriers and motorcycles on the night of December the 17th and 18th. Commander stated that Russian forces recently increased the number of guided glide bomb strikes from 14 to 16 strikes during an unspecified previous week to over 30 strikes this week. And that is in the Seversk area. So just if you don't know where that is, sorry, I'm moving around here quite quickly as if you know where everything is. Some of you might not. Seversk is there, so it's north of Bakhmut in this area, south of the Chesivyar forest. Anyway, we're going to go on a rotation around the front line in a second. Let's just finish this. An officer of the Ukrainian brigade operating in this Seversk direction reported on the 18th that Russian forces have been displaying a higher level of training and coordination between units, which the officer attributed to recent command changes in the 3rd Combined Arms Army. So that's interesting and a little bit of a shame there. When we go to the Kursk Oblast in the Russian territories up here, where the Ukrainians are attacking and holding on with white knuckles there, you can see that the Russians have made some fairly substantial gains over the 5 days in this northern area. Ukraine's still trying to hold on desperately to the area northwest of Malaya Lokhnya, but the Russians taking some area, some fairly considerable area to the west there, and also further to the east around Cherkasoye, Porochnoye there. So the Russians taking quite a bit of land, although there's a difference between the two mappers still. The light pink is where Andrew Perpetua's previous line was, and you can see the blue line is where he has the Russians now. So he says the Russians have taken control of this area. Surat map's very different, saying that they already had that area pretty much, and now they're taking much more land further to the south and southeast. And then further down at the southeastern edge of the entire sector, the Russians, according to Andrew Perpetua, taking some more land there, which is inside where Surat already had the Russians controlling Cherkaskaya Konopelka. That is the area there. So with the Institute for the Study of War has a few bits to say on this. So fighting continued in the main Ukrainian salient in Kursk on the 18th, and there were no confirmed advances. So those advances from the previous 5 days, it appears, or 4 days. Russian forces are attacking in small and large infantry groups, but are using less equipment due to Ukrainian first-person view drone strikes. There are lots of roads of death there, lots of equipment that the Russians have had attrited. It's been very painful for them in this sector, although the Ukrainians themselves will be losing quite a bit as well, because they are not so much on the attack, but it's just quite dynamic around there. Okay, so still activity around the Lipsy and Vovchansk areas. Supposedly the Ukrainians having attacking still in the Chesivyar area. If we go back to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian military blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces counterattacked toward Chesivyar, and a Ukrainian battalion commander stated a couple of days ago that Ukrainian forces recently gained a foothold there as well. They have been actually getting more and more success around here, slowly grinding back some of the territory, but it's hard going around there. Volchansk doesn't seem to change too much, but it's still fairly active. The Russians still pushing there as well. Okay, then we come down to the northeastern axis from Kupyansk here to Svatove, and then down to Kreminna here. You can see up in the northern area north of Kupyansk around Sinkivka that Andrew Perpetua has the Russians now back across, or not, but I suppose back from the original sort of lightning counter attack all that time ago. The Russians are now back over the Oskil River. He has them sort of similar to Syriac maps there, having some considerable land going towards Zapadny. So that is definitely a concern for the Ukrainians. And getting across further to the north as well, they've got up these large escarpments, or these chalk cliffs here. They've got over that, it seems, and that is definitely a worry. I would not be happy with the Russians being that side of the river, Oskil River, anywhere really. Okay. Coming further to the south, we can see that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in this Kolesnikivka area south of Glushkivka. There are some claims about this. The enemy was knocked out of the forest in this area. According to Deep State maps, the defense forces managed to knock out the enemy south of Glushkivka. In recent days, our units have been securing and repelling Russian attempts to return to the forest. So that's that forest there. Ukraine is pushing the Russians out. Good news for the Ukrainians there, although they are getting pressured further to the south as the Russians are pushing westwards towards the Oskil River, further to the south than they have control. Well, that previous unfortunate excursion across the river up there. I guess if you're going to cross the Oskil anywhere, you much rather Russians did it further up here, further north towards their border. But it's not cool. Anyway, coming further to the south, some gains around Terny for the Russians according to Syriac maps. Just some small fields there, nothing too much to worry about. And then we come down to Chesivyar. First thing to note is that over the last 5 days, there have been no changes to these two mappers, although there are some claims that the Ukrainians have made some gains in the refractory plant area of Chesivyar. If you can see that red roofed facility there, the Ukrainians having some success. Where are we? That's here. So if we look on the map, see if there's any considerable difference. Yeah, so it's pushing the Russians back over to here. So according to Grayskull, the Russians are back defending this area, and the Ukrainians, this will probably be grey zone, but the Russians not in control of that. So you might see some changes to the Chesivyar area with our two mappers here in the coming days. I'm not 100% sure though. This is though from today, so actually that would track. It could be that the mappers might be catching up with that. Obviously, some data to suggest that Ukraine is pushing back in Chesivyar, which is good news there. Then when we come further to the south, some changes around Donetsk, where been a bit of push and shove. The Ukrainians pushing the Russians back at this tailings heap, this spoils heap there. One of the many in the general area, but essentially the Russians just squeezing extra streets out to the south of Donetsk, in the center of Donetsk, and pushing out towards the west as well, north of that tailings heap. So Russians having a little bit of success, but for the last 5 days, it's not too bad, all things considered. No change to the northern part of the Kursk front line, particularly some small gains around Krasny Yar and Mykolaiivka. There's a couple of small fields north of railway line going up there to Pokrovsk. And then it's all a bit more worrying here as they're getting closer and closer to Pokrovsk. Some people saying, Russians saying they're only 3 kilometers from Pokrovsk. Although there are claims that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in Shevchenko. Grayskull here said, albeit the other day, this is now going back 2-3 days, the Ukrainians are reportedly advancing in Shevchenko. So this is where they've been loading in some reserves in this area. That the idea there, the claim there is that the Ukrainians have retaken this field area and are pushing back into Shevchenko. So this area could change a little bit. Don't know whether this is the Anne of Kiev, French trained and equipped unit that has potentially, some are claiming that they have been sort of split up and given to other existing units in the area. Others claiming that that's not true, but you definitely need some help around here. The Ukrainians definitely need some help. So the Russians still making these steady gains, fairly substantial gains around the southern area of Pokrovsk. It's looking, very challenging for Pokrovsk going forward. And then as we come further to the south, both mappers showing some further changes around the area on the way to Karakovo. So you've got all these different sort of villages, Zoria there, and another one of Sontsivka, and further to the north, much further to the west of Svatove. So some video footage I showed you this morning were Russians looting apartments in Svatove, taking belongings, laptops, and all sorts of things, because that's what they do. They are liberating people's property. Okay, so from the people who own that property. Now, as we come down to Karakovo, still lots and lots of activity here. Look, a blue pin, that's a rarity. But basically, the Russians pushing through Karakovo. They've been stalled a little bit to the north of the reservoir, which is good news, but the Russians still pushing on most other places. Down to the south around Uspenivka, this whole area has now been taken by the Russians. I don't know if the Ukrainians lost significant casualties here or POWs. There were claims about them being surrounded, and it was all a bit troubling. Then there were supposedly some attempts to relieve those soldiers in the area. I don't know how successful that was, but I haven't seen anything too critical in terms of Ukrainian taking massive casualties there, but it might well have happened. This has been a really difficult area for the Ukrainians, as the Russians are just piling on all over the shop here, and it does look like Karakovo's days are somewhat numbered, as the Russians are almost certainly going to fill this in as they approach Andriivka. There's another Shevchenko there, and another Petropavlivka like there is up in Kharkiv. Goodness me, typical naming issues there. So as we come down from all these like voluminous pins that are whacked in all over the shop over in this corner of the map, we can see that around Velika Novosilka itself, in Velika Novosilka itself, there's a bit of stasis there, which is good news for the Ukrainians. But north of there, Russians are retaking that Novyi Komar, which was an area where they had taken, then the Ukrainians pushing back out, and now it appears that they're back in there. And when we come to the south of Velika Novosilka, the Russians are slowly pushing up that Mokry Yali River here, that meanders all the way down to the south, past Staromir, or through Staromilsk and Uruzhaini. Now the Russians are comfortably past there, further to the north, and filling in all of these gaps along the river until they get to Neskuchne. Not too much change going further to the east, although we do have some pins here around Nestoryanka, which is on the way towards the reservoir there. So Robotna here. Further to the west, Nestoryanka, just moving ever closer to Orikhiv. That's certainly a bit of a worry there. That's quite an important staging post for the Ukrainians, although it's taken one hell of a hammering from artillery and whatnot. That's the pretty much the story of it at the moment. 5-day update there, so it's a big update. I think, what's the kind of TLDR? Still holding on in Kursk. Some worrying signs across the Oskil River. Ukrainians fighting back in some places and keeping it stable in others, but still losing significant ground from Pokrovsk downwards. Really, I guess you can say Toretsk downwards. That Donbass front is a real challenge for the Ukrainians. So fingers crossed that they can bring some reserves in to stem the flow of territorial losses there. Let me know what you think. Really appreciate your support. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.